Are you disgustingly well read? Let's find out. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to my channel, Eclectic Reads. Currently, there is a trend on social media of people making videos about how to be disgustingly well read or disgustingly educated. I've heard disgustingly overeducated. And this is not, of course, new. People have been talking about being well read for years, for as long as books have existed. But what I have noticed is this trend has also been about performing education and also performing attraction. So it's not just about being disgustingly well read, but also being the most attractive person in the room, being very beautiful. A lot of this content is being made by women, which is actually interesting because in the past, videos about being well read were predominantly made by men. So I think that's been really interesting. Now, I personally don't care at all about being the most attractive person in the room or being the hottest person. I think this trend really goes alongside the hot girl summer trend, the it girl, all of that. I don't care about that. Nor do I actually care about being perceived as well read. That being said, I do care about being thoughtful about what I read, and I do think that that can be a really good goal. So today I wanted to talk about what I think it means to be well read, and then I will also recommend some books to you. Something that I've noticed about this current iteration of being well read is that the books that are being recommended aren't necessarily classics. They are books that engage with social and political issues today. And I actually really like that emphasis. I like that the books are a little bit more socially engaged than the ones that have been recommended in the past. Now, I do think that reading from book lists can be helpful. If you are reading books, say, published in the United States over the last few hundred years, you could read books from different eras to understand different literary movements or to understand how people were perceived, different issues were addressed. It can actually be very insightful to read books from different time periods and from around the world. But I really do like the fact that there has been an increasing interest in reading books that engage with the current moment. So, I'm going to talk about two channels that I've seen on YouTube that has been recommending books to help you be disgustingly educated or well read. The first one is the channel Mars Library. I will link the video that I'm going to be discussing below. She recommended a few books. Two that struck me as really interesting were The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, which talks about the migration of 6 million Black people from the South to the North and the West, beginning end of World War I through the 70s. And then another book that she recommended was Invisible Women by Carolyn Criado Perez, which looks at the male bias in data collection and how that harms women. I've known a little bit about that. For example, airbags, they're tested on men of a certain height. But then what does that mean for women who's are usually not as tall, who's who are physically not built the same? Are the airbags safe for women? I'm 5'2". Are they safe for me? And then there is another channel called Classically Claire, and she has been posting shorts about books, both fiction and nonfiction, that can help you be disgustingly well read. She recommended The Persepolis Duology by Marjane Satrapi, which is a memoir of the author growing up during the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And then another book that Claire recommends is Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, which discusses Aldous Huxley's dystopian future in which society comes to an end through entertainment. And that is a book that also has caught my attention. I would be very interested in reading that since I've been reading a lot about technology and its impact on learning. My corner of BookTube has also taken up this conversation. Carl at Please Read Your Book posted a video recently, I think only a few days ago, titled You Don't Need Serious Books to Be Well Read. And Carl's thesis is that it's not about reading a certain kind of book, but it's about reading books that have had an impact on you. And those books could be books that have not been celebrated by the literary establishment. He mentions science fiction authors whose books are often seen as light and fluffy, but actually deal with some very serious topics. And if they've had an impact on you, then they have helped you be better read. And I wanted to piggyback on what he was saying, but also expand on that by giving you my own definition of what it means to be well read. To me, being well read is about thinking with books. So it's not necessarily the kind of book, but it's about my own posture toward that book, my own engagement with that book. And so you can grow from reading any kind of book. And indeed, in academia, which is my background, there are people who have written entire dissertations about pulp romance. They've read many, many romances, and they use that data set to understand how authors think about gender and relationships and all kinds of bigger issues. So it's not necessarily the book itself, but it's about how we approach that book. Any book that gives me greater insight into humanity and into my own society and just myself, and that does stick with me, is a book that I know has helped me grow as a person and has helped me be better read. And so while I am all for reading books that have withstood the test of time, you can grow from reading anything. That could be Sarah J. Maas. It's about how you engage with the books. You could make really thoughtful videos about books that aren't necessarily the most literary. And this is why book clubs can be so valuable. The book club chooses a book, whatever it is, but it's in the discussion that you really tease out the different topics and themes in the story. Now, don't get me wrong. You are absolutely allowed to read books for fun, to escape. Everything does not have to be an intellectual exercise. And it isn't always for me either. Sometimes I just read books because they're fun. I love reading cozy mysteries. Sure, I could use cozy mysteries to examine representations of small town, or, how is the amateur sleuth presented and all this stuff. Or I can just read it for fun to escape, and that is perfectly acceptable. So, this is the part of the video where I will talk to you about 10 books that have had an impact on me. 5 fiction, 5 nonfiction. There are so many other books I could have chosen. I basically went through my Goodreads read shelf. I have over 700 books on there that I have read since 2014 when I started on Goodreads. And I chose 5 fiction and 5 nonfiction that have really resonated with me and that I wanted to recommend in no particular order. Let's start with fiction. The first book is one that I've been wanting to make a video about for the last decade. It has had probably one of the greatest impact on me, and that is Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. It is, in my view, the best satire that has ever been written. The story follows Lemuel Gulliver, who goes on a voyage and visits all of these different lands with very quirky creatures. And along the way, he starts to think of himself differently depending on the people that he meets. Lemuel Gulliver is an unreliable narrator. And I have read this book about 5-6 times, and every time I read it, I notice things that I didn't notice in the past. Like I said, I want to make a video very soon about this book and why I think that everyone should read it today. The second book is actually a short graphic novel, and that is Goliath by Tom Gold. Tom Gold is pretty popular on the internet because he makes some really funny cartoons. This book actually isn't particularly funny. It is an interesting look at the biblical story of David and Goliath, but told from the perspective of Goliath, who is recruited by the Philistines to be a soldier. And he doesn't want to fight in the war. And it's a book that really looks at war and who we consider enemies in war. The third book is one of the best books I read in school, and that's Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. I have never read a Woolf novel that I didn't like. I've read Mrs. Dalloway, Flush, and Orlando, and I gave 5 stars to all 3. But Mrs. Dalloway is the one that I've read the most and has had the greatest impact on me. It is a hard read because it is written in stream of consciousness, but I also feel like the writing style itself suits the narrative, which follows one day in the life of Mrs. Dalloway, Clarissa Dalloway, who's throwing a party. But at the same time, some other people are not having the best times in their lives. And it is very much a character study, and I just think it's brilliant. So I recommend it to anybody who wants a good challenge, but also the payoff is great. The fourth book is actually quite controversial, and that is Go Set a Watchman by Harper Lee. Like many Americans, I was assigned To Kill a Mockingbird in middle school. I was in 8th grade when I read To Kill a Mockingbird. And of course, I loved the story and I watched the film. But when I heard that Go Set a Watchman came out and that Atticus Finch was not the hero, I was intrigued because I felt that for once we were moving away from the white savior narrative. And that is what Go Set a Watchman does. Atticus Finch is racist. And reading the story from the perspective of Jean, Scout, who is now older and who's now more aware of the world, I think was exactly what I needed to read at the time of my life when I read it. It is a book that I definitely think people should read after reading To Kill a Mockingbird. I actually want to reread the two back to back and see what that experience will be like. Now, Go Set a Watchman is not very well edited because Harper Lee did not intend on publishing it, but I think today it is the book that needs to be read. And it was one of the best books that I read the year that I read it. And the final book is a children's graphic novel, and that is Swim Team by Johnny Christmas. This graphic novel follows a Black girl who moves schools, and she now has to join the swim team, but she doesn't know how to swim. And her classmates, who are white, are making fun of her, bringing up the stereotype of Black people not being able to swim. And this novel follows her as she learns to swim and joins the swim team. And it also gives a lot of really important information about the racial history of public swimming pools, explaining why it is that Black people have not had access to swimming in the way that white people have. So those are the 5 fiction novels. And now for 5 nonfiction books. The first I would like to recommend is The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. I read this book when Black Lives Matter first was created. So this was before George Floyd's murder. And I wanted to understand better the history of police brutality. And this book focuses on the war on drugs and how the war on drugs was a response to the Civil Rights Act. And it was a way of trying to limit Black people's mobility and opportunities. And a lot of it is about how the war on drugs in targeting Black people disproportionately helps perpetuate inequalities, and then also talks about like the police violence that goes hand in hand with that. It is a book that I highly recommend. And then I would also recommend The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. So this book looks at housing segregation not as something that like individuals perpetuate or the neighborhoods perpetuate. It's not just, some white people who don't want Black neighbors. This is something that Rothstein shows was legislated by the federal government. The banks, because of the federal laws, prevented Black people from being able to get mortgages. Like this is, and this is the point of the book, is that when we talk about racism as something that is just an individual or maybe a community-based thing, we forget how racism is legislated and has been legislated historically. So I would read The Color of Law after reading The New Jim Crow. Both books really help you understand systemic racism in the US. The third book is a book that I read last year and was one of the best books I read, For the Love of Men by Liz Plank. We all know, or at least we should know, that toxic masculinity harms women. Of course, it does. But it also harms men. These very rigid standards of what it means to be a man limits boys and men, causes mental and physical health issues. Liz Plank talks about this extensively in her book. It is a book that I would recommend to any parent of boys. It is really important to be aware of the ways in which society holds up a certain vision of what it means to be a man and how that harms boys and men. Number 4 is American Zoo by David Grazian. So Grazian is a sociology professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and he volunteered at 2 zoos to understand the zoo as a concept. It is a liminal space in that, on the one hand, the zoo tries to bring wildlife to the guests. And yet at the same time, it is an artificial space. The enclosures are artificial. The animals could not live in the wild. They would not survive in the wild. He talks about the people who work at the zoo, who are predominantly women, but the leadership is male. It talks about how conservation is presented at zoos. Even though the United States is probably contributing to global destruction more than any other country in the world, the focus so much is on Africa and Asia, and South America. Deforestation, some like Asian medicine that uses rhino horns. And of course, this stuff is important. But it's interesting how much silence there is around the ways in which the United States contributes to global destruction. And perhaps it's because oil companies are sometimes the sponsors of these zoos. Like Texaco, they have sponsored zoos. And that conflict of interest is something that zoos have had to deal with. I love visiting zoos. I support the work they do in conservation, at least the AZA accredited ones. It made me more aware of the space, and it is a book that I highly recommend. And the final book is also a book I read last year, and that's Empire of Pain by Patrick Radden Keefe. I wish that more people watch my video on Empire of Pain because I talk about that book alongside another book about the father of public relations. And that video, I think, really helps us understand better how advertising changes the way that we perceive everything. So I'm going to link it in the cards because I do want more eyes on it. I put in a lot of effort in the video, and it's one that I'm very proud of. Empire of Pain talks about the Sackler family and the 3 brothers, starting with Arthur Sackler, who was a psychiatrist, and also very heavily involved in advertising. Now, the Sacklers started Purdue Pharma. Well, they actually bought the pharmaceutical company, but then made in what it became. And they are famous for producing OxyContin, which is a narcotic that they very aggressively marketed. And for that reason, they are very responsible for the opioid epidemic. But every step of the way, they denied that their drug was addictive, even while their salespeople were marketing to doctors the highest doses of this drug. And it is very much an expose about the corruption in certain pharmaceutical companies. This book doesn't talk about Johnson & Johnson, but there is another book that does. I will put a picture on the screen. I started reading that, but I put it aside for a while. Johnson & Johnson has done the same thing. And while anti-vaxxers frustrate me and people who just don't listen to doctors, I also understand why that has happened. These pharmaceutical companies have not done themselves any favors. They have lied to people. They have bought the FDA. And this book was so infuriating to read, so brilliantly written. This is a masterpiece of investigative journalism. And I would highly recommend Empire of Pain. So those are the 10 books that have had an impact on me, that have helped me see myself in new ways, see my society in new ways. And, these are books that really lend themselves to thinking with their content. You have to be engaged to really appreciate the books. What books would you put on a list to recommend to people to be disgustingly educated, if that's the goal? Thank you, everybody, for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye now.